This week, we welcome Josh Corman, founder of I Am the Cavalry, to discuss securing all the things and all the things that can make things more secure. In the security news, how car theft actually works, a UDP joke, attacking your GPU through your browser, embedded security people even, silent patching, dash cams, CA certs in Apple, Blue Spy. Did Craig Wright create Bitcoin? Breaches are still rising, NIST is no longer enriching, and time to delete your Glassdoor account. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Identity is at the core of every great digital experience. Ping Identity's solutions support the scale, flexibility, and resiliency required by enterprise-level IT teams for lasting digital transformation. With 99.99% uptime and over 3 billion identities under management, they're the only identity vendor that's proven to champion the scale, performance, and security of large enterprises. That's why Ping Identity champions your unique identity needs. They give you the tools to offer your users the right access at the right times, no matter how they connect with you. Visit securityweekly.com/ping identity to learn more. Are you ready to go beyond pen test reporting? Elevate your offensive security and measure risk reduction by streamlining pen test planning, report creation, and findings delivery. Request and attend a one-on-one personalized demo today at securityweekly.com/PlexTrack, and PlexTrack will send you a Starbucks $10, Euro, or Pounds gift card totally free just for your time. That's securityweekly.com/PlexTrack. Coming to you live in super low definition from G-Unit Studios for now. Compliments of Darth Vader himself. This is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 821, being recorded on March 20th, 2024. I will start with the in-studio hosting guests. Mr. Jeff Mann is to my left.
Hello, Paul. Had to come here one last time.
One last time until we come
I'm
back
occupying
here again.
Larry's spot for the time being.
Maybe we'll explain next week. Mr. Doug White is here with us. Doug, welcome.
I am. Also, for one last time, I was like, I know it's going to be reconstituted as the secret underground studio broadcasting live from the desert or something, but
Something like that.
But yeah, I wanted to come to the studio one last time. That's the title of the episode.
One air quotes last time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Josh, I'll do your introduction like properly once I get introduced to everyone else. But Josh Corman is here in studio, and I'm going to introduce him in just a moment. Mr. Bill is remote. Welcome, Mr. Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I wasn't invited to the party that you're throwing at the studios today, but glad to be here remote. Hey, everybody, and nice to see you.
I mean, you remember what happened last time. We'll just,
That's true.
You know what?
That's true.
All right.
I haven't been invited back since.
Miss Mandy Logan is here with us. Mandy, welcome.
Good evening. And I was thinking, I'm so glad that my remote sensory implant in Doug is working because I'm getting the full studio experience right here.
That's it. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us as well. Sam, welcome.
Good evening. Glad to be here.
A quick and very important announcement. Google has announced that they will be shutting down the Google Podcast platform in mid-2024, because that's what Google does. To ensure that you don't lose access to Security Weekly content you know and love, make sure you subscribe to your favorite podcast feeds on alternative platforms, which this may be the most comprehensive list ever, such as Spotify, YouTube Music, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, or anywhere else you might listen to podcasts. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to find the buttons to subscribe to each show. Let's see. Mr. Josh Corman is here in studio. He is the founder of the I Am the Cavalry movement, recently served as chief strategist for CISA, the COVID task force. He previously served as CSO for PTC, director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative for the Atlantic Council, CTO for Sonatype, and many other positions. He co-founded Rugged Software and I Am the Cavalry to encourage new security approaches in response to the world's increasing dependency in digital infrastructure. His unique approach to security in the context of human factors, adversary motivations, and social impact has helped position him as one of the most trusted names in security. He also serves as an adjunct faculty member for Carnegie Mellon's Heinz College and is also a good friend and featured on an upcoming, this year we'll be releasing the Hacker Heroes episode with myself and Josh Corman. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Awesome to be here. Last time in this capacity, but not last time in this room.
Right.
Hey, does anybody else think he looks like Nick Prococo right now with
Yeah,
the
a little
beard
bit
and the
with that
glasses?
The glasses.
Oh,
Yeah. Mm.
Welcome, Josh.
I remember the first time Nick had that beard.
Yeah.
I thought he was going to end up on a watch list.
So you're here to talk about securing all the things
Small topic.
with policy?
Sure.
Maybe I should have called it securing all the things with policy. Is that how we secure all the things?
No, but it's a lever, right?
It is. I think it's an important lever.
And policymakers are going to policy. The question isn't if they're going to do it. It's going to be if it's tech literate and informed and helpful, or if
Right.
it's harmful.
Yeah, I had a very negative opinion of regulation in fear of over-regulation. And Cory Doctorow came on the show years ago and corrected me. He's like, look, regulation's important. It got us things like the telecommunications infrastructure we have today. He's like, also, he said exactly what you said. Policy's going to happen with or without you. And maybe Bruce Schneider also said the same thing, right? And so you might as well be involved.
Yep.
It gives us a better chance of having, I like smart laws and smart legislation.
Yep.
And I feel like we end up with a lot of really silly laws. I mean, there are silly laws, but there are good laws and regulations as well.
Yeah, I think naturally the hacker zeitgeist, not being joiners, not being orderly or more chaotic, don't like this idea. But there's a time and a place for it.
For sure. Do you want to talk about? We talked about the FDA stuff that you were involved in the last time you were on the show? So do we skip that, or do you want to give us an update on that first, then go into some more legislation that you were involved in?
If you like.
Yeah. Let's do that.
Yeah, I think since the last time I was here, a lot happened during my time at CISA during the pandemic.
We covered that.
We covered that. A lot of it will be in the Hackers Heroes. But when we were trying to protect the nation's 7,000 hospitals, most of which are 85% of them are small, medium, and rural. They don't have a single qualified security person on staff. Most of them don't even have a single IT person on staff. So you can't just tell them to just do best practices, just do the NIST CSF, just do zero trust. They can't do those things. So we had to get really scrappy. And I said, let's meet them where they are. And you also have to do something that can have an immediate effect on reducing risk. So we kind of taught CISA and then Congress and the White House the notion of they're target rich, and that adversaries are interested in them, but they're cyber poor, and that they have insufficient information, incentives, and usually resources to do anything. So quite a bit of the policy that came out of that during my time there, even though we were there for hospitals to keep people alive and their supply chains, we were also there for the vaccine supply chains, and a lot of them were target rich, cyber poor. But while we were there, think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the things that keep us from being Lord of the Flies. Water, food, shelter, safety. We had successful attacks of water facilities, the food you put on your table, oil and gas pipelines for the Eastern Seaboard, the schools your kids go to, municipalities who run towns and cities, and timely access to patient care. And one of the things my team did is we used statistical proof of loss of life, that a ransom can stress hospitals and regions sufficiently to drive excess deaths as tracked by the CDC. So once you start seeing insecurity or unavailability of water, food, electricity, oil and gas, once people are dying, partisan issues go to the side, and you saw a significant political will from House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, White House. So we had kind of like a real surge in political will to pass a bunch of stuff. Some of it was okay, some of it was really good. One that we didn't
hang on, John. To prove that what we're talking about is impact, right? But to prove that impact, did we just have to talk about it, or did some people have to like suffer? Like, did we have to see it in the real world first?
Yeah, I think we always knew this could affect patient care and patient outcomes, but we had to prove it, not just once, but a lot, because it's really uncomfortable, and a lot of people are afraid of liability, or they're afraid that it would trigger regulations. So even when you have proof, lots of proof, different kinds of proof, and we can enumerate some of them if you want, you had to have enough where they just couldn't win the argument anymore.
Mhm.
So one thing that was happening right around the time I was here recording that episode, I had just testified to the Senate on the healthcare committee about the first losses of life, and there was something coming through called the Patch Act. It's an acronym, but it was to give mandatory seatbelt laws essentially for medical devices. So up until then, the FDA had done a good job recalling devices based on Billy Rios research. We built enough trust, but it wasn't binding. They didn't have a budget to do it. They had to kind of get creative like hackers to figure out how to make that happen through a different law. So it passed the House almost unanimously, and the lobbyists threw millions and millions of dollars to kill it in the Senate.
Mhm.
So part of that hearing was the co-sponsor of the bill was a physician from Louisiana, and he was trying to decide if he should fight for this or not. And through the course of just having irrefutable evidence in a case that we shouldn't be playing fast and loose with patients and human lives and hospital closures, we didn't know it at the time, but I was on my belated honeymoon with Audie, and I got like 10 text messages saying, "How'd you do it? How'd you do it?"
Mm.
And in the omnibus package at the end of the year, it's really, really hard to get anything into an omnibus package. Like they were trying to pass it different ways, and lobbyists successfully put up obstacles all year. So we thought it was going to be dead. And the guy fought his ass off and put it in. So in December of 2022, signed into law. So now we have
And then it took an effect.
pretty
FCC started doing stuff when?
the FDA.
FDA, sorry.
Yeah, the FDA had to do initial rulemaking by March, so they
Mhm.
started enforcing it in March. That
Mhm.
3 months later, and they gave sort of a little bit of a grace period where they said, come October 1st, we won't even start evaluating your medical approval for pre-market until you have all your evidence, all your SBOMs, your threat models, proof that you can patch. So
Wow. So they put it as the first gate, not just
yeah, you
like
can't
the
even
last
start.
gate.
Yeah,
Right. You can't even
yeah.
start the process unless you got your house in order in
Yeah.
terms of cybersecurity for a medical device.
And we don't want to get too wonky, but they call it an RTA, a refusal to accept.
Yeah.
Yep. So basically, they've been doing some decent cyber the best they could. But you might recall we wrote a 5-star automotive cyber safety framework on our first birthday
Mhm.
for the cavalry. We made a Hippocratic oath, which was basically the same thing. And we said all systems fail. You have to handle 5 failure modes. How do you avoid failure with safety by design, which had things in it like SBOM and threat modeling? How do you take help avoiding failure without suing the helper? We were trying to decriminalize good faith security research because we didn't have our carve outs yet. Number 3 was how do you capture, study, and learn from failure? How do you have a prompt and agile response to failure? And how do you contain and isolate failure or fail safely? So that became the blueprint. So it took about 9 years, start to finish.
Yeah.
In fact, the Congress staffer that I briefed on my very first day on the Hill on January 7th of 2014, she kind of laughed at me during my briefing. I'm like, look, this is my first time on the Hill. Am I doing something stupid? She goes, no, it's a great idea. It's going to take a decade for this town to do anything. So when it passed, she was the first person I called when I got home, and I'm like, I beat you by a year.
Yeah.
and I don't want to pretend like we single-handedly wrote a law. And
Sure,
9
sure.
years should not be considered a victory.
Yeah.
But
Did you say you were involved with another piece of legislation that was passed through?
yeah, this one.
I don't want to downplay the medical thing.
Oh, yeah,
We'll come back on it, but
and that's not the only thing that political will happen from the COVID work. But yeah, the first one was quicker, but not as successful. It was the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act. After the Mirai botnet showed $100 cameras that are on the internet, unpatchable with hard-coded passwords, it's probably kind of not too safe. So Senator Warner got really concerned about that. There was a bipartisan bill in the Senate, bipartisan bill with Will Hurd and Robin Kelly in the House. And it failed the first time through and kind of got watered down a bit with some NIST assignments and things. It was really, really clear the first time. But that did pass after about 4 years from inception to passing. But those rules had not even been made yet. So they've been kind of sitting on the rulemaking, even though it passed.
So they said so what does it actually say?
The original one said you had to do 5 things if you wanted to sell IoT to the federal government. So it was using the power of the purse for the federal government. You had to be patchable. You shouldn't have fixed hard-coded passwords. You should be free of known exploitable vulnerabilities on the day you sell it or declare when you have them. You should not roll your own crypto or protocols. You should use standards-based crypto or whatever unless you declare why you're not doing it. And you should have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program.
Right.
Embracing hackers acting in good faith. So those were the 5 things we had. They were pretty no nonsense. But committees were fighting over how it was done and shouldn't it go through our committee. So NIST ultimately got an assignment to come up with their own standards. And what they came up with later, like 2 years later, was close, but not the same. and I believe their deadline to make the rules is June of this year. So even though the Patch Act took 9 years start to finish, it went into effect already. The IoT one is pretty close to going into effect.
Mhm.
But the CRA, which I know we're going to talk about later,
Yeah.
is kind of like the Patch Act for everything else.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I didn't realize that we had the IoT stuff, but that's just if you're selling to the federal government.
yeah, and the rules haven't been put into place yet, so it's still kind of in limbo.
I gotcha.
You remember the Schoolhouse Rock videos? How a bill becomes a law?
Yeah.
I was thinking about that just a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
It's like, Paul, don't you remember your schoolhouse?
I think I went
Rock?
back and watched some of
What
those
they never
videos.
tell you is even if you get it, passed through Congress and signed by the president, it can still rot and sit on the shelf for a long time.
For a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it
even
doesn't
when
mean people are going to do anything about it.
And even laws
necessarily,
that get
yeah.
rulemaking sometimes don't get enforced. So, we're kind of learning that if people want to sabotage safety and security, there's lots of ways to sabotage.
They can do it after the fact,
And
after it's been passed as a law.
And I've learned many of those tricks.
Mm.
And each time they do a new trick, we
adapt.
we get smarter.
Right. Because we really do I firmly, I'm biased, right? But in this case of IoT and or appliances, firmware-based things, I think we can all agree as cybersecurity professionals, the state of securing those devices is in a very poor state right now.
Yeah.
I mean, CISA itself was compromised.
Is in a
from
very
one of
poor
these
state.
devices.
Is that what you were going to say?
No, not CISA.
Oh, okay.
They had a device that was in very poor state.
Okay.
Well, this shows that one of the other things I've been pushing forever is the software bill of materials, SBOM stuff. And while that did successfully make it into federal law for the Patch Act, there was an executive order going through. And when the executive order was written, it mentioned SBOM 11 times. And now that the final attestation form came out last week, it mentions SBOM 0 times. So this is an example of trickery from people that don't want accountability and transparency.
Right.
But one of the reasons we did that is if you don't know that the security products you're using or the networking products you're using are using unsupported end-of-life operating systems or have known exploited vulnerabilities in them, then you're going to have a bad day sometimes. So,
and we're seeing that, especially with, I don't like to pick on vendors, but you can read the cybersecurity news today and find any number of vendors selling VPN firewall appliances. I'll pick on that for a moment. There's other areas we could delve into, but this is the hot topic right now, right? And so you basically, as an enterprise, you buy this thing and you put that thing on your network and you don't have a lot of visibility into the thing, and it does its thing, and then you're hacked. Then you get hacked. Someone discovers that under the covers there was a vulnerability there that could be exploited.
Yeah.
And I'm like, so what do we do about this? Because this is an increasing problem for sure.
And a huge number of the attacks now are not against the final goods assembled product. They're against third-party open source libraries in the bowels of that dependency tree.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes not even open source, which is interesting. Sometimes a commercial component.
Yep.
And so what do we just need to be better defenders? Do we need to have more scrutiny on what we put in our organizations?
Oh, there's so many things that need to get fixed, but
there's a shared responsibility here.
Yeah.
We can't just expect that every time we buy something to use in our organization, that it's going to be 100% secure all the time.
Yeah. So post COVID, and it wasn't because of COVID, but post the things that my team of outsiders and insiders we just kind of broke glass. We said, how do we do the best we can to protect these organizations if they don't have money, they don't have staff? What can we do quickly? So I'll rattle a couple off quickly, but then I think the thing that connects that shared responsibility is the White House strategy, because people keep getting really confused, like secure by design, secure by default, versus like regulating these different industries. I'll try to do it very quickly, but step one was I said, screw best practices. Let's talk about the bad practices. So CISA.gov bad practices was 3 things for these target-rich cyber poor. We said, just don't do these 3 things.
Yeah.
Like if you can do anything, try to find and reduce these 3 things.
But I want to polish you right there.
Yeah.
That's an interesting approach, because I think oftentimes we've talked about these are all the things you should be doing. Like I think we spend our careers going, you should do these things to secure your network, not necessarily like take a step back. Like don't do these smaller subset of things that sometimes that's easier to grok, right?
Yeah. And there's a level of what I was doing. And so prepare to, throw up in your mouth a little bit for some of the things I'm going to say, but this shouldn't be the end of the story. It was just like, look, hospitals are getting attacked. Maybe the thing we do this week could be the difference between if they get swept up in an initial access campaign or not. So step one was the bad practices, which was the use of unsupported end-of-life operating systems in service of critical infrastructure is dangerous, especially egregious on internet-facing technologies. Second one was the same sentence, but it was the use of fixed, hard-coded, and well-known passwords is dangerous. The third one was the use of single-factor remote administration tools. That's how water facilities were getting hit a lot. So those three things were like, that's where you start. Like, this is the negligence line. Like, if you can only do one thing, do these things. Immediately after that, we said, well, okay, if we're talking about internet facing, we want to get them on some free scanning. But no one would sign up for the free scanning. They didn't trust the government. They didn't know who CISA was. So we said, okay, get your shit off Shodan. But I couldn't say the word shit and I couldn't say the word Shodan in a government paper. So we called it SOS, get your stuff off search. And we made an infographic that says you should.
I remember that. Yeah.
Enumerate your internet, see what your adversaries can see, your assets are showing. Remove the things you don't need, harden the things you do need, and rinse and repeat on a regular basis. And if you don't know how to do that, here's a free nightly scan from CISA that'll send you an email and fix the KEVs. But we didn't have the KEVs yet. So the third thing I did is I said, you guys have been tracking these KEVs, and sometimes you tell them through TLP Amber alerts. Can we just start publishing the KEV catalog, the known exploited vulnerabilities?
I think having a catalog was the game changer.
Yeah.
I think we all saw the alerts come from, I mean, even 20 plus years ago, we'd see the alerts from the various, ISACA groups or whatever, your internal groups. You'd see it from the government, all these external things like Amber Alert, but having a catalog was handy.
Yeah. So the strategy after that, in the after action reports, Congress did a bunch of stuff like pass the Patch Act. In parallel, they were passing CERCIA, which was the rule that says if you're in critical infrastructure, you have to tell CISA within a certain number of hours or days if you got hacked. Like the Colonial Pipeline was the political will for that one. But think of two strategies, a top and a bottom, where there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors. They each have a regulator. I'm not going to tell you what they all are, but that was through Presidential Policy Memorandum 21. In each one, what the White House said is there's a time and a place. They said voluntary only takes you so far because we all preferred voluntary. This cybersecurity framework's been voluntary for 11 years. And all the reports showed people were volunteering to ignore it.
Right.
Like almost no one was doing it. So then they said, we'd like Josh's. So what do we make them do as minimum hygiene? Like if you want to open a commercial restaurant, you have to have kitchen sanitation codes. You want to fly airplanes, theoretically, you should bolt the, screw on bolts and things. So they said, the time and the place, voluntary only takes you so far. There's a time and a place to use government regulation. The time is now. We're going to use a light touch, but no lighter than required to maintain the trust and safety of the public. So if you're a regulator with unused or underutilized regulatory authorities, now's the time to do so. Do so now. Here's how you should do it. And what they tasked CISA to do, and people have made fun of this list, including myself, but the idea was out of the 400 pages of the NIST cybersecurity framework, people needed a crawl stage, like an on-ramp. Like, you can't do everything. What do I do first? So they tasked them to build on our bad practices, and they called it the CPGs, or the cross-sector cyber performance goals. So CISA came up with 38 foundational things like asset inventory, known mitigation of vulnerabilities. So just 38 of the entire corpus of NIST. And what they told the regulators is start with the CPGs. And because every industry is a beautiful, unique snowflake, add some stuff on top of that. So your foundation is these 38 things, and then add your sector specific wisdom, and do so now. So immediately the water and wastewater did it. HHS has been trying to do it. It's not been going
No one
so
said
well.
38 was too many.
They did. In fact, I intend to talk about that when we talk about healthcare, but that was the strategic intent. Do these 38 plus some special sauce. Because while each of you are beautiful, unique snowflakes, you all have the same melting point.
Right.
And some of you are skipping the basics. So that was what the top of the half of the diagram is. The bottom is that, okay, well, if you're a water and wastewater or a hospital and you're buying stuff that can't be patched, that has hard-coded passwords, that is using unsupported end-of-life stuff, you can't possibly defend your environment with crappy equipment. Right. So the secure by design, secure by default was CISA's answer to that. There's also a call for software liability finally, which is going to be harder to push, but it's going to happen in Europe anyhow sooner. So usually when you hear them talk, they don't differentiate between the secure by design, secure by default, patch act. Those are SBOM. Those are things below the line. Anyone selling up until those 16 sectors. And in parallel, they're asking those 16 sectors to do a much better job. So I'll stop there for now.
Both, but it's both. It's the suppliers and the consumers both have a shared responsibility to.
Yeah, you need defensible equipment that you own and operate in a defensible way.
How does your list of 38 items compare to something like the CIS top 20?
Very similar. The CIS list, the prioritized list of controls, which included the SANSTOP 20 before that, the DSD, ASD from our allies in Australia, the signals directorates. Most of the world's prioritized listing start with asset inventory and things like that. So the process they went about was looking at what all the 16 sectors were doing, but also looking at wisdom from other places.
Josh, how do we tell the suppliers how long they have to support their products for? How does that work? I mean, you mentioned there's 16 different critical infrastructure, verticals. It's very important that they have long support for their products, right? But how do you tell the commercial world? You can't tell me they get to support something forever.
Nope.
But there's a cutoff, and how do we deal it? But then the onus goes on the consumer to go, I know I got to replace that.
And it wasn't my list of 38. I was gone by then. It was inspired by our work, but they came up with that list, and a lot of people argued over what should not be on it. None of the U.S. policies have attempted to do what you're saying and tell the private sector how good or bad to be. They just said, here's the things we think are minimum hygiene for any products. Europe, on the other hand, while we were working on the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act, Europe made this thing called in the UK, they made the Code of Practice, which was very similar. It had 16 controls, but 5 or so of them were really the core ones. And one of theirs is one of your obligations in the UK. This passed, so this is a UK law that we influenced, but not a US law. They said you have to publish how long you're going to support the product for.
I was going to say, isn't that the middle ground is
just be honest about it.
You got to say when it's going to stop.
So it becomes something that could go into contractual terms and conditions, like we're going to support this and patch it for this long. And if you see if you go to the Best Buy, you want to get a router, and one says, we aren't patchable and we aren't going to support patches, then next to one that's equal price and features, but they say we're going to patch for 5 years from purchase date. Another one says we're going to patch for 3 years from the purchase date. I mean, I think you and I were talking to someone on Twitter.
Yeah, but from the consumer end, I don't know, that's a different story. But I think when you're in procurement for government or large organizations,
or a hospital,
or a hospital, you're going to pay attention to that.
But are you? How do you?
We need to evangelize that you should.
Yes,
right.
The UK law is for everybody.
Okay.
So the US has not weighed in on that. But my expectation, there's a couple volunteer industry consortiums pushing IoT minimum standards. There's this notion of a cyber seal that a lot of people are fighting about. In those, it's possible you can voluntarily do that in order to get the seal.
But even if a procurement office knows that they should do it, they're required to do it. How do they make the argument? We got to spend more for this because it's. I mean, I guess it's a cost analysis or something, cost benefit analysis. If we pay more for this one, it lasts this much longer than this one that's only going to last this long. Don't they need a little bit of
I think they
accounting help or something to be able to
they might already
push
do
out?
that to a certain extent.
And one thing people need to remember, and I'm not picking on IRS when I say this, but once you have laws, you're trying to make the easy path,
Right.
the safe path, right? People can get exceptions, they can get waivers. They're called POEMs when you're in the federal government.
Right.
People can cheat on their taxes. They can find creative loopholes. This does not mean everything will be safe, but we're creating a more harmonized way for people who sell products and people who buy products to enable free market forces, right? We're showing them the kind of things that you might not have known to consider, but you should consider. In the private sector, there's no requirement for this. It's just kind of like buy what you want to buy.
You started this conversation by saying you kind of threw out the best practices, but isn't
not
there
for good? Yeah.
Well, but there's still something to be said for liability and cost of a breach when you were doing something you were supposed to do versus not doing something you were supposed to do, right?
Yeah, and I don't think you guys want to go through a comprehensive list of everything that get changed in cyber since this unpleasant period of the pandemic.
Right.
But you might have heard of a few that, as a system, they work pretty well. So the Security Exchange Commission came out with a bunch of rules for publicly traded companies. They're going to be pretty hard to meet if you're buying products that are unpatchable with hard-coded passwords. So when you have an event, you have to disclose an 8K form now, and it could affect your stock price.
Yep.
So that control combined with these things now create an incentive to go buy the things that are less likely to get you hacked. So if you're in the government agencies, CISA has these things called binding operational directives or BODs, and they can require agencies to do certain things. So the noose is tightening on the operators, what they're responsible for, on the suppliers into those operators. Some of the big vendors with a lot of technical debt are just lobbying against it, choosing to ignore it,
Sure.
saying it can't be done. But then they're in a procurement cycle, and 3 of the people that are bidding on the project can do it, and you're saying it can't be done. So at some point, you're going to start to lose market share. So my idea, because just like you, I didn't like regulations at all growing up, right? Didn't think I would, is that free market forces tend to work.
Mhm.
Sometimes they don't. It's like when your car is, if you have an alignment problem, you're going to wear out your tires, you're going to have worse gas mileage, you might have an accident. Sometimes it's really, you want to use a really light touch of regulation to nudge things to better have a self-maintaining free market.
But there needs to be, I think, the proper incentives and proper disincentives.
Yes,
'Cause
carrots and sticks.
you know that I, have been doing this one voluntary compliance thing for 20 years now. And
CPI or something like that?
yeah, something like PIC, something like that. But I mean, everything that you've talked about is in there. There's nothing that you've talked about that's not in there. And yet, in terms of the 38 or the 20, the 3 things to do, things not to do, it's all in there, and it's been in there for the most part for 20 years. So, when you talk about not wanting regulation, and I've heard you and
You
many
and I
others,
have thought about
we have
PCI.
thought about that.
Yeah.
But, it did move the bar for a certain set of companies in this country and the world, begrudgingly, but it's made an impact.
Yeah.
And I kind of think that there's lessons to be learned there. Do the regulatory bodies talk to them? Do they look at them at all as a model of what to do and what not to do?
Yeah, and I really hope we don't get stuck in a PCI discussion, but when the
We will try to
I
avoid
was
it,
just
but it's
about to pull.
unavoidable.
I was just about to pull us out of the PCI rabbit hole.
Okay.
Yeah.
spray bottle. Maybe the pivot is the PCI Council and most of its supporters had an incredibly heavy influence on the NIST the NIST cybersecurity framework.
Yep.
But again, that was not being implemented, and I think the huge difference right now that I hope we do get to, and I don't want to sound like sky is falling or doomsday prepper here, but you had all 4 heads of the cyber agencies for defense of the U.S. say in unclassified hearings a month ago that just look at it's related to, but not isolated to Volt Typhoon, where we have Chinese actors that they've ejected from U.S. critical infrastructure, and they've been sitting there. They're not doing ransoms. They're not trying to get, extort money. They're there to disrupt and destroy U.S. infrastructure, likely in 2027 when they say they're going to take Taiwan and they don't want us to interfere. So we have straw houses soaked in gasoline with detonation devices in many of them. There's an article today about the water and wastewater, yet another article about compromises. We haven't evicted them all. I think it was Jake Williams said most of the victims of Volt Typhoon had no telemetry, no sensors, no management, no rigorous. So we don't even know if we found them all, and we
Right.
certainly have not. And if that's 3 years from now, we don't have 20 years to crawl, walk, run on
Right.
the stuff like water and food, electrical. I do think that the biggest mistake the government's making is when everything is critical, nothing is critical. And I think we should be focused on the lifeline: water, food, power, and emergency care. And those are among especially water, food, and emergency care are among the most prone right now.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me because, where I grew up in the government, the risk working for a 3-letter agency had to do in one way, shape, or form with human life. Troops on the battlefield, citizens abroad, State Department workers, and so on and so forth. But in the private sector, it's always about money. But now we're finding these things that, well, no, it's back to human life again, which
It's about safety.
it's a little bit more easier to
I wanna,
absorb it or pay attention to it.
I want to dig in on known exploitable vulnerabilities.
Exploited.
Known exploit. Yeah, because there's
Kev
a
is known
difference. Well, that's the
exploited.
first. That's the
a
first
big difference.
That's the
Huge
first
difference,
difference,
yeah.
right? Is I've seen it in the wild, someone exploiting this vulnerability versus, an exploit exists, but we don't have telemetry that says necessarily anyone's using it.
Yeah, and I hope your listeners know this by now, but out of every CVE written, less than 3% get exploited ever, so far, that we have evidence of.
We have talked about that.
Yeah, I
Not
also,
lately, but we've
CVE
talked
is-
about that.
you and I can agree that CVE is only
I hope we talk.
a smaller percentage
Yeah.
of the known vulnerabilities that are out there.
Well, we got the last time NVD was in trouble with Congress was because of me and some other people pointing out that free services like OSVDB, which is not
Mhm.
maintained anymore, but Jericho for nothing,
Mhm.
and risk-based security, we're having 60%. NVD was about 60% of their private sector database, often with volunteers. So I'm not even saying that. So let's do this. Of all the vulnerabilities out there, 60% of them were CVEs. Of the CVEs, 3% were getting exploited ever that we could see. Mass exploitation.
But I think we also have to. So my friends Josh and Kurt, Open Source Security Podcast, were talking similarly about this, and they have a lot more experience.
Josh Bressers.
Yeah. But he was saying that open source software has got to be, I don't know what the number was for the number of lines of code or projects or whatever in open source is in the millions, right? And every year we publish about 30,000 CVEs to about 8 million different projects that are open source.
Yep.
And that's just open source.
And
that's not commercial software.
There's very few CNAs assigning CVEs for open source. That's getting a little better.
It is.
In part because their efforts. And increasingly the attacks are targeting those. So most of the CNAs are for the big commercial enterprise products, not safety critical, not industrial IoT, not medical, not OT.
But I guess my point in this discussion, this part of the discussion, is how can we accurately know what's being exploited and or vulnerable when we're maybe only tracking a much smaller portion?
Well, that's what I'm getting in the Venn diagrams is we were patching based on CVSS, which is stupid, right? EPSS and H.G. Moore's Law kind of proved that. The reason I like Kev is you can take all the debate out of it. This actually hurt people. So it was in the wild and hurt critical infrastructure because that Kev list is still not all exploited. It's just the ones that met their criteria.
Correct.
So those are the unarguable. Do not pass go directly to patch Kev, right? If you have Kev,
but wait,
on
what's
the
the
internet,
bias in Kev? It's not if we've observed it, but we've observed it in a specific industry.
They have not been as clear as I'd like them to be about the selection criteria.
Okay,
but if it makes Kev, shut up, stop debating it, and prioritize it. And I actually had tons of arguments on my SBOM work and other things. And I teach at CMU, so all of our students want to patch on CVSS. So I have tons of arguments about this, but I had a bunch of vendors making their own weighted average of what to patch first, and they had Kevs lower than stuff that never got hacked. And I said, why? And they said, well, CVSS is really, really high. I'm like, and I don't want to just play whack-a-mole after people get hurt. I want to be left to boom. But if we haven't even touched the stuff that is hurting people, what you're working on that might hurt you, 97% of the time won't hurt you or hasn't hurt you. So in the crawl, walk, run, at least when I look at critical infrastructure, and look, put this through the lens that I had, which is in the next 3 weeks, if this one manufacturer of polar lipids gets hit, another million people are dead. What can we do in a 3-week time frame? So we couldn't get them to patch everything, but we got them to focus on the internet-facing stuff with those 3 sins and or a Kev on it. And subsequent to that, the White House asked for the next round of responsibility, which was the
how do we go deeper?
CPGs, and then the sectors were supposed to aim high. We have to get to healthcare at some point on this because the healthcare guys just turned in their homework in February, and they decided to declare victory when they said, we made HPH sector-specific CPGs, and HPH is the healthcare and public health sector, and there were 10 of them and 10 bonus ones. And I'm like, last I checked, 10 is less than 38.
Right.
So if out of the entire NIST framework, the easy button was, it's not easy to do, it's not free, but the starting point, the floor was 38, and they made a sub-basement basically. And the 10 they have are going to get some funding, and hospitals are going to get allowed to get some assistance to meet those 10 for 2 years. And then after that, they might lose Medicare and Medicaid eligibility if they don't do those 10 things. But what I said is you can do all 38 CPGs and you'll still be hacked. This was not to say this is effective. This is to say you're at least in the fight and starting a program that should continue to improve.
Right.
If you start with these 38. What I wanted to see from them, because they're sector-specific wisdom, CISA people will never know healthcare. So what the healthcare people should have said is, hey, you know what the central nervous system in a hospital is? It's electronic medical record system like Epic or Cerner. There's not a single thing in their list about hardening the one thing that gets shut off in a hospital that can lead to denied patient care, denied
Absolutely.
billing, it may put you out of business and put you in the
I
morgue.
mean, if your generators work, you conceivably you could go without power.
Right, right.
But if Epic's down, who's seeing
You're
patients?
done.
Yeah.
In fact, we better talk about Change Healthcare too,
Yep.
because none of us were fighting about things like payment middleware.
Mhm.
But when this payment middleware went down, an estimate of 3/4 of U.S. hospitals can't do billing, can't approve things, can't approve pharmacies, and people are definitely dying. And more scary to me, since we already had 200 hospitals close their doors forever in the last 5 years. Another 500 to 700 have been so weakened they got bought in a predatory acquisition and mothballed. One of the acquisitions has bats in the 5th floor in Florida. So
Mhm.
like when they get acquired, they don't necessarily stay open and healthy. So we've lost about 10% of the hospitals in the country. And if minutes or hours are the difference between life and death for heart and brain, and they are, if you don't live less than 3 hours away from a hospital, you're going to die
Mhm.
in those circumstances, or you're going to have a higher chance of dying. So right now, my biggest concern is we're going to give them a cost and a Dumbo's magic feather and a false sense of security on these 10 things. And they're still going to get hacked at the same rate they're getting hacked. And we're going to see another 1,000 hospitals close. So we're kind of in a death spiral where we don't have any money to do anything,
Mhm.
because it is the truth that these small, medium rural hospitals have no money. They both cannot afford to do cybersecurity and they cannot afford not to. So we've let them get weak enough now where they're kind of designing for what people can afford instead of what they need. And between now and 2027, we're now in 2030, which is when they want to have their entire plan rolled out. We've already lost maybe 1,000 hospitals. We're going to lose 1,000 more.
And it's interesting though, but they've already acquired technology. Excuse me. So when we think about requiring that suppliers don't have any known exploited vulnerabilities, and we'll segue into the EU CRA,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's like what's being sold from point forward, where we're requiring security. Doesn't help us in the healthcare situation, as an example.
Yeah, there's a
'Cause
long tail.
They
Yeah.
already acquired all this stuff.
Yeah. So the thing I was proudest about with the Patch Act is that if you make all the medical devices safer, then whether you're a rich hospital or a small, medium, rural hospital, you still get better stuff.
Mhm.
So it was an equal opportunity, like lift up. The problem is medical devices tend to live for about 15 years in the wild. So the stuff coming off the truck now, if you close in the next 5 years, you're not even going to really reap the benefits of the Patch Act for more than a handful of devices. So some of the senators want to do a cash for clunkers thing where we look at the
Mhm.
most
Yeah.
dangerous devices like
Right.
heart, brain, pulmonary bedside infusion pumps.
Mhm.
And if they can't meet these secure by design, secure by default, that we would give them a cash trade in towards
Mhm.
one that could. So like that kind of a stimulus is better than just throwing cash at somebody. It's
Yeah, I like
saying,
that way better. Yeah.
and it's not saying let's sprinkle penicillin dust over all the sick patients and cure none of them. It's saying you can survive driving 3 hours for a hip replacement. You cannot survive driving 3 hours for a stroke.
Mm-hmm.
Time is brain. You get about an hour. So I really want to say, look, after 9/11, the analogy I use is after 9/11, we realized that hijackers can get on commercial aircraft and turn it into a missile. We couldn't just throw away all of our airplanes.
Yeah.
So one of the
Yeah,
smart things we
right.
did is a
Yeah.
steel reinforced cockpit door.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been asking for years now, what are the steel reinforced cockpit doors for a hospital that is ransomed to continue to function on the life-saving, time-sensitive stuff? And that's the kind of like scalpel surgical approach we should take for now. Now, we eventually want to get everybody doing all of the best practices and all the right things and have a vibrant, living, breathing risk management program. But between current state and desired state, if we don't show some pragmatism and some focus, more harm will
But what's
happen.
the equivalent of, to use your analogy, I can no longer take a nail clipper with a little, knife on it onto the plane.
I haven't thought about that. And there's a lot of security theater, and most of the things we did after 9/11 were useless or
Absolutely, yeah.
harmful.
Yep.
The reinforced cockpit doors was not one of them.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
No, I lost my train of thought.
I hope
where
this
we're
is
going.
what you wanted.
No, but I lost my train of
CRA.
thought.
I think you were going to pivot to CRA.
Well,
I was trying to pivot to because I wanted to talk about S-bombs.
Okay.
And so, but I wanted to talk about you've got gear, you're acquiring gear. In both cases, an S-bomb can help you know what you're going to get, but also help you know what you have. So when you talk about legislation or regulations that are going, you need to make sure this stuff isn't in your environment. Well, if you don't know what's in your environment, you don't know what's inside of the things in your environment, then how can you go, hey, government, like I need all new infusion pumps. because they have this vulnerability. And I know that because there was an SBOM created. It's actually a really valid use case for an SBOM.
The thing I care more about is it running unsupported end of life software? Is it having no? I mean, you want to hear something scary? Like I'll let you try to guess. I might have said this during the Heroes thing, but we successfully got the first recalls in history for medical devices for cyber without anyone having to die first. Usually, you have to have proof of harm, a lot of harm, and then you can do a recall. We proved that an unmitigated pathway to harm was enough for cyber to issue recalls. So there have been a lot of recalls now. And one of the most popular devices in the world was that bedside infusion pump. And it can empty a 3-hour dose in 30 seconds and kill you. So it's a pretty dangerous thing. It's not FUD, right? We could demonstrate harm. And we do so through a different nonprofit we started called cybermedsummit.org, where we do ER hacking simulations. We show physicians flounder when the device is compromised. And we try to see, does it affect patient outcomes? And it always does. So it's not so much the SBOM part. It's that a lot of these devices that I saw that did get recalls, and I felt really good about it. I later found a hospital in Pennsylvania. It's not unique. I just looked really deep at a hospital in Pennsylvania. If you had to guess which percentage, now these are not all cyber recalls. Like there's lots of reasons FDA does recalls. If you had to guess which percentage of the equipment in a children's hospital has a recall associated with it, but still in actual use.
I'm thinking it's a high
50%.
number.
It's probably a high number.
You think
right?
50%?
80%.
It was 90%.
I thought 75.
It was 90%. Now, it broke my heart to see that. And they don't have any money to replace it. So, and we're not just going to write a check to have them replace all that stuff. But that's not even saying you have an SBOM or threat model or not. Those have a recall for a known safety device to a clinical device. And they're still using it. So
even with an external indicator, we can still be in trouble.
What we're doing is we're giving decision support. And if there's a Log4j going around, which hit lots of hospitals during that Christmas run, my CISO friend in California, she asked all of her vendors, do you have Log4j? Am I affected? She got answers back within a day from a small number of them. She got, within 2 weeks, she had answers for about 45% of them. And a year later, she still doesn't know the answer. So when she's trying to say, is this thing so dangerous I should unplug it? Or where should I focus my fire? Where should I patch it? Which thing should I replace on my next budget cycle? She'd want to know if this thing had known exploitable parts in it, if it was recalled, if it was end of life, if it was using broken crypto. So my goal has always been to either create, I mean, the ultimate fix here is software liability, which makes people uncomfortable, but that allows the producer to take a risk. They can say, we don't want to fix it. We're just going to take a risk. And if they got it wrong, they're going to pay for that risk. Right now, all that risk is passed down to their customers blindly. So in lieu of liability,
passed down also to what did you call it? The last supplier?
The final goods assembler?
Yeah, the final goods assembler. That's the term I was looking for. Because that goes back to wooden wheels or something.
It does. Good memory.
Yeah. Tell that story.
But if you're saying that...
No, hold on, Jeff. We were on to something.
Okay, so McPherson versus Buick in 1917. Family was suing for their lost loved ones. They were suing Oldsmobile. And Oldsmobile said, it's not our fault. Go sue Firestone. They're the ones who made the wooden wheels because there weren't tires yet. Firestone didn't make tires. They made wooden wheels. And the court
Jeff
ruling,
remembers. It's fine.
Yeah, you were alive then, right? Yeah. So the ultimate rulings from the court said, you as the final goods assembler are in the best position to identify risk in your supply chain. You're responsible. So this puts the onus to say, let's make sure that we don't buy deficient parts, bad parts, et cetera. And then they squeeze their downturn suppliers because we're all in a supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. And even if you're trying to do the right thing, someone might sell you something with booby traps in it. And, or they might have been using something that's unlicensed or end of life. So these things kind of all come together. But right now, there's no hospital legislation or regulation to say you can't use recalled devices that are taking care of your baby in the natal intensive care unit, right? So at a minimum, we want to find some way to make sure they have better equipment. But when you're in the process of better, then you can look at, are they patchable? Do they have end of life stuff? Do they have a threat model? Do they have a coordinated disclosure? And then when a KEV comes out, ideally the FDA could say, hey, we know all of you have this library that's being attacked. Are you safe or not? So we want to get in this life cycle where, not that you're never going to get hacked, but when there's a widespread thing, can we have very quick decision support? And then maybe eventually somebody says, look, if you can't even tell me what's in it, I'm not even going to buy it from you. What Sunil, you would do at Bank of America, even like 5-6 years ago, was he would say in all of his procurement language, "I want an SBOM." If they said no, he's like, "Well, okay, I want a 20% discount because I have to do more work every time there's
Right.
a new thing." And their choice was a 20% discount, which will be lifted once we start getting transparency. So he started getting it. It doesn't. You could substitute the word SBOM for patchable. You could substitute the SBOM for liability.
Mhm.
I think the key here is defenders don't have a fighting chance when they're buying stuff that can't be defended. So we want to ratchet up the responsibility and elective risk and transparency where there is residual risk for the people selling into safety critical. And you want to have the people who own and operate safety critical to have some hygiene responsibilities as well. And it's not going so well. We're
Josh,
trying, but
but
it's not going
Josh,
so
why don't vendors want to give us an SBOM?
well. There's a 1 hour talk I did at RSA, which will outline this eloquently with pictures. But
Break it down for the three things.
So there's a lot of smoke screens. They say it can't be done, but it is being done, or it takes weeks, but it takes seconds if you're using modern build tools. It's just a byproduct of GitHub or Jenkins. The real three things that they're hiding that we should just find a way to get from current state to desired state is, number one, some of them have violated license terms and conditions, and they know that copying to this will get them sued. If you remember that Netgear got acquired by Cisco and immediately got a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from the open free software fund.
You mean Linksys?
Yeah, Linksys. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Number two is so they have legal exposure that they know they're going to have to settle on, and they're trying to hide it as long as they can. Number two, they have unfixable or economically unfixable security debt. So something like it's Apache Struts 1, or it's can't pass FIPS, encryption standards.
140.
Yeah, if they get this revealed, their customers will correctly skewer them for passing this egregious risk. And the reason I say unfixable is when you get in a car accident, you could always fix a car, but if it's totaled, if it's the cost of fixing it is not worth the cost of the revenue you're going to get out of it. So we know there's scary technical debt, at least right now. And those will drain out with more transparency, right? Sunlight's the best disinfectant. And the third one's manageable, but they're nervous about it, which is armed with an SBOM. When a new KEV is published or a new attack in the wild, they are concerned about the ongoing scrutiny and accountability they'll have from their customers to say, where's my fix? Right now, someone like Oracle is famous for this. They'll get a disclosure, but they'll sit on it for like 3-6 months, and they'll decide when they want to patch. So they have a lot of latitude as to when to patch. And they're concerned that this might drive a service level agreement that says for KEVs, we need a patch within this amount of time. We need an answer of if we're affected within this many days and a patch within this many months, or you owe us money back. So it's really, number one, license exposure for lawsuits. Number two, very costly security debt, like the deep dark sins. And once those are both gone, you're still going to have an ongoing accountability to answer your customers.
Is there a future? I mean, based on what you're describing there, I keep thinking that's criminal. That's criminal. Is there a future where there's criminal liability versus just civil liability?
Most of the sector says if you do software liability, you'll stifle innovation and kill the economy. A lot of the people that used to say that are starting to realize, me being in control of my own choices is actually pretty free market and pretty economic. This is the only area in the species that doesn't have liability. And Andrea Matwishin, who you should totally have on the show, she's a law professor. She wrote this brief called The Internet of Bodies. It's not about hacks that kill people per se. It's like when you have a cybernetic limb and you don't pay your bill, does your limb stop working? Stuff like that. All the parts of law that would be touched by more and more connected humans. But in there, she's actually pointed out that everyone says software liability would kill us. There's actually pockets of software liability already at the state level and in other certain narrow cases. So software liability is part of the White House National Cybersecurity Strategy, and people are talking about it and are looking at it. And the fallback alternative is this secure by design, secure by default as a safe harbor. And by the way, they can work together. If you do turn on software liability tomorrow in Europe, and it might happen within the next 2 years, by the way, then you might be able to say all that SBOM and transparency stuff that we were fighting, this could be our safe harbor, which is, hey, we told our customer what was in it and they used it anyhow, or we offered them a patch. They didn't apply the patch. In a world of software liability without those safe harbors, you're responsible for the harms caused by your products, like a ladder. Like in the world of ladders, even if someone's doing something stupid on your ladder, you're still responsible for the accident. Whereas in this kind of a world, you could theoretically say you're responsible for the things you didn't disclose. But if you offered a patch and transparency where you didn't, then you could limit how much liability you
It's like power tools, at least for a time, came with 6-inch cords on them,
have.
right? Same
So,
principle.
and I'm not even saying all these ideas are good, but here's what's happened. Once we started messing with water, food, shelter, and loss of life in hospitals and hospital closures, we're going to do something about it. Now, the doing something about it is painful, and there's a lot of lawsuits. Like the EPA does water and wastewater. All they said was about 2 days after the president's strategy came out, they said, "Okay, we're going to do it. You already have an annual sanitation survey for all these water treatment plants. All you have to do this year is tell us which of the 38 controls on the CISA list you have."
Mhm.
It's not making you do them. It's just saying which ones do you have. They wanted a survey so they knew across the country how bad is the deficit. And the response to that from the sector coordinating council and all the trade associations in 3 states was, "How dare you? We're suing your ass." And they did. And the White House backed down.
Hmm.
So like we already know that water is under attack. With Volt Typhoon, we
Mhm.
saw they're under attack more. If you saw the Cyber Avengers thing from Iran, they attacked a whole bunch of water treatment equipment with a password of 1111. So we are seeing that the adversary's here, and we aren't even willing to tell the government which of the 38 controls we're doing or not doing. So it's going to be bumpy because people like voluntary, and they don't have the budget to do these things, but they also don't have in the budget class action lawsuits that result in these things. They don't have equipment replacement budgets for when something breaks or blows up. And there's also a cost to your customers who suffer when they don't
Mhm.
get these vital lifeline services. So I think we let things get as bad as they can get for as long as they could. Now we're realizing we have to do something, and now we're in the really ugly fight over what will we do and how quickly.
And is underwriting going to get involved in that?
They have.
Because they're getting involved in that
Yeah.
because that always seems to drive. I mean, I know there's the same argument about regulation, about this stifles innovation and so forth.
Yeah.
But if your underwriters say, if you don't buy these sprinkler systems with a little diamond on them, we're not going to provide you with fire insurance.
Yeah.
As they start doing those things, even though they say we don't have any money, they can't get insurance. I mean, it's always a double-edged sword, but
Yeah, there's when I did the CISA.gov bad practices, there's a group called Cyber AccuView. It's the top 20 underwriters of cybersecurity in the world. And they ratified, we like this list, we're going to build on it.
right.
So it can affect if you get insurance, how costly that insurance is, what the caps are. So like they'll insure you for driving,
Right.
but it's void if you were driving drunk.
Right.
So also the credit rating agencies. So it's people that look at credit rating, they've considered looking at hospitals at the percentage of your equipment that has a recall associated. And if it's over a certain amount, you can't borrow at as nice a rate. So lots of parts of the economy can do their job once we start creating these pieces of information or data flow or visibility or transparency.
Is some of that just because it is so obscure and esoteric? It's easy to understand that if somebody hits the back of my car and it explodes, that's pretty obvious. But we start talking about all this stuff and S bombs and everything, and it kind of goes over a lot of people's heads, I think.
And we don't have a clear idea of what's going to land. The thing that's going to hit first is the CRA, for unless your medical devices have already landed here. But CRA is going to be where the rubber meets the road on some things, just like GDPR. We weren't doing privacy laws here, but you still lose money as a U.S. business if you can't honor GDPR. Right. So one thing I do want to say, though, since we're talking about the China thing by 2027, a lot of people are just like, well, we have insurance. Let me just remind people something. There's an exclusion in every insurance policy for active war. So if you think that we can get away with doing no security hygiene for cyber physical critical infrastructure because we have insurance, the two warnings are it's getting harder and harder for you to get insurance unless you have these things. But more importantly, if it's due to a Chinese disruption, you're not going to get paid.
Right.
The EU CRA.
Yeah.
What is high level? What's your take?
There's a really good blog post from Harley Geiger. He's one of the guys that we've worked with on lots of this stuff. He's at Venable now, so I'll give you that for the show notes. But one way I heard it put is it's kind of like the Patch Act for everything else. So if you know what I did with the Patch Act, they want product security minimum standards for anything sold to the EU. So not just to the government, not just to medical. In fact, the exclusion is if you have a different sector-specific regulator like FDA or automotive, they won't touch that. But it's kind of a catch-all that here's things that you need to do for product security for selling to the EU. And it just passed. So it has passed.
So it did pass.
Yeah, it has one more step, which in the US, what happens is if the if the House passes one version of a bill and the Senate passes a slightly different version of the bill, they have to go to conference. And even though they hash out the conference, they need one floor vote to say, yes, we all agree to the thing we just agreed to.
Mm-hmm.
That last ratifying vote is supposed to happen in the fall. But it's expected to pass as written. So if you read the final version, that's it. That's what you're going to get.
And does it say known vulnerabilities or known exploitable, known
Oh,
exploited?
gee. I should probably have looked at this right before I got in the room.
No,
I think it said known vulnerability, known exploited vulnerabilities, exploitable.
Yeah.
And there's a couple different sections. One of them is all vulnerabilities. So,
Mhm.
like Cercia here, where if you get breached, you have to tell the EU within a certain amount of time. So that doesn't matter if it's known or not. It just matters if you had a breach, irrespective. It could have been social engineering. And number two is if you had an exploited software flaw, you have to share that exploited flaw with the EU within a certain amount of time. Those two take place 2 years later. So once the law goes into effect, you get most of the CRA, but those two mandatory disclosures, both for breaches and for vulnerabilities that got exploited, those are going to be 2 years after the rest goes into effect.
Quick question. Without getting into the difference between exploited and exploitable, how does these laws define known?
They have sections that define them.
Okay.
And every country has their own. Not everybody uses the National Vulnerability Database. Every country has their own cert. And the EU has the 55 of them. So I
You mean not everyone tries to use the national?
I mean, but at a high level, what is intended by the word known?
I think they broadly defined it. I'm sure it's in the text. I don't have it memorized, but
Sure.
I think it's going to be, does it have an ID in any of the 55 certs or vulnerability databases?
Okay. So known, recognized by people that look at this kind of stuff.
My hope in the rulemaking and how this plays out is I hope they initially focus on known exploited instead of just all known,
right?
For the reasons we talked about a few minutes ago. Crawl, walk, run.
But like, I don't know, a month or so ago, we were talking, and Paul, you'll remember the details. We were talking about a vulnerability that I think you guys discovered that got patched and then a CVE wasn't issued.
That happens a lot.
So would that be considered known?
I would hope so. Yeah.
But I think we're going to talk about that in the next segment too. We're going to talk about silent patching because Rapid7 just got into it with, I believe, JetBrains. It's exactly the same situation that we were in at Eclipse.
Ubiquity routers did it years ago. I mean, I remember Jericho brought that to my attention.
Right.
Router manufacturers were
so known should be notorious. Just Jericho know about it. I'm not totally kidding either.
No, but it's a good question though. What is known? I mean, someone observed it somewhere, but that means that we have observability.
Yeah, and thresholds observability is a good test, but thresholds have to be established. Like every one of us has tons of germs and bacteria in our bodies. We might even have lumps in our bodies. It doesn't mean that it's going to kill us, right? So not the presence of bugs or defects or flaws, even maybe exploitable ones, that does not make them all equally serious. So if there isn't a stratification of this, we're gonna regret it. But right now we have no accountability. And I think one of the things that makes me happy is the rugged DevOps guy, is that I realized a long time ago that most of our security gains don't come from doing security work. They come from removing elective complexity, elective attack surface. They come from having less stuff that we don't need. If you've heard Sunil's thing about pets and cattle, right? Like, we have a lot of stuff we keep around just in case. For 365 days a year, we use it once a year, and it's vulnerable every day. So what I have found is in the financial services area that was doing SBOM before it was required, they were doing it to save money, a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars a year. And what they found was, like, once they started looking at things like the vulnerability or which projects were dead, they stopped using 15 different logging frameworks across Aetna. And they went down to the top 3 that were the best maintained. They didn't use dead projects. They used active projects. They didn't use every version of every supported library. They used the most recent API stable ones. So you saw, even though we didn't design it this way, although some of us did, we didn't advertise it this way. more code started getting smaller, microservices better maintained, only use it if you need it. And it naturally drives down elective complexity, which is the enemy of everything, not just security.
Right.
So my hunch is, all right, here's an example. One medical device maker during my congressional task force in 2017, his team said, we can't fix all the flaws in here. There's 14, they paid like someone like Billy to look at their device. They had 1,444 CVEs. So we can't fix them all. And their boss made them come in on a weekend, bought them pizza, and they ended up updating 7 packages that got rid of 1,000 of those 1,400. 7 package updates. The product was better. The number of support calls for glitches and bugs was better. The uptime was better because they were on more modern stuff. So yes, they still had some residual to triage, but 7 updates got rid of 1,000 things that could have hurt the hospital and hurt their brand and gotten them fined or sanctioned.
Right.
So my hope is that we did this stuff without looking or caring. As we start to look, we might make smarter choices slowly over time. And then when it comes to Lifeline stuff, I hope it's not so slow.
Right.
Really quick, what are you working on next?
I'm working on too much. So I left the private sector on the 10th birthday that I am the cavalry. So the birthday was August 1st. I headed to Vegas on August 4th, a free man. I told the room, I don't know if the cavalry 10 years later should end, transform into something else, or combine with other initiatives to get to critical mass. And I said I was going to take up to 3 months or so, make that choice first for how the next 10 years should look. And once I know what that is, then I'll decide how to feed my family. So I'm doing a terrible job because that was 7 months ago. What I've been working...
Eating ramen noodles and such. Yeah.
Yes. What I'm doing intensely almost every day is the healthcare regulations for hospitals. It's an absolute food fight with public-private sector. There's things the sector's doing that I think are very problematic. There's things that HHS is doing that are very problematic. So I'm working with the White House, with Congress, with HHS. I'm really focused on healthcare. I do have a couple ideas as well for what to do with the cavalry. Maybe we talk about it, maybe we don't. But I think, just like I've been hinting, the areas that need the most help, most urgently, are the target-rich cyber poor, and not in every sector, but in water, in food, in electrical, and in urgent care. Because if we can't take care of those things, really bad stuff happens. And not eventually, because in real time, every time I think I'm going to go now turn to my job hunt or something, the Change Healthcare, 3/4 of hospitals are affected, and many of those small, medium, rural had 1 to 4 weeks cash flow on hand, and we're now in week 5. So they are on fumes. They're laying people off. They're furloughing. Some of them are closing. Some of them are now going to be the victim of M&A. And so I'm spending an awful lot of time being an idiot altruist, trying to make sure that we do the right thing while we have this window open before we commit ourselves to harmful things. So right now I'm neck deep in healthcare, and the Change Healthcare has also opened up a new can of worms. I think I told you about on the phone, but there's a thing that we've been trying to do at CISA since it was born. The Cyberspace Alarm Commission loved it. Jim Langevin here in Rhode Island loved it. It's called SICI, or sometimes called SIE. It's systemically important critical infrastructure, or a systemically important entity. And the idea is, for each of these 16 sectors, there's only a handful of companies that if they get hit, really bad stuff happens to the whole country. Clearly, Change Healthcare is one of them. So I got the last word in a CNN article about this. I said, if we don't proactively identify our SICI, our systemically important entities, our adversaries will continue to reveal them for us,
right,
while we burn. So Congress is fuming angry because everyone's been kind of like looking at the sky, looking at their shoes. The private sector doesn't want a SICI list. They don't want to be on a list. They want to be paid extra bonuses and immunity if they're on a list. But there's about 6 choke points on the nation's food supply, any one of which you would mess with, and we have really big problems. 6. Okay, 6. Now, there's lots of entities that would hurt, but there's 6 that would be crippling. And within healthcare, there's probably a dozen or 2 dozen. What I want the public-private partnership to do is identify those so that we can give them assistance left to boom. We can get an emergency contact name, do a tabletop crisis simulation, know what the playbook should be if we do have a bad day, and right a boom, they should get prioritized instant response and help and emergency funding.
Right.
And they are unwilling to do it. The agencies don't want CISA involved. CISA is afraid to ruffle feathers and look like a regulator. The private sector doesn't want it. But we are now at the point where people are like, where the hell is our SICKI list? Because we can do all we want for manufacturers of medical equipment, which we have, and we might catch up on hospitals that use the medical equipment. But if none of them can actually do transactions or get paid or get medical records, it's all dead in the water. So I think the other fight I'm being sucked into now is it finally time for SICKI?
Time for SICKI. Well, on that note, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back and do the security news. Josh, thank you.
Thank you.